This is the A Minute to Midnight Show with your host Tony, and welcome today, folks. I'll be interviewing Marcia Montenegro, and it's a very interesting interview. Don't forget our website, aminutemidnight.com. Visit us there. All our shows and articles are there, as well as on YouTube and on iTunes. I want to offer a very warm welcome on the A Minute to Midnight Show to Marcia Montenegro, who has now been on a few times, and it's really nice to be talking to you today, and it's a fascinating subject. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say on it. So welcome, Marcia.
Hello, Tony. It's so nice to be with you again.
And yep, I think this will be a really, really interesting discussion. Now, I just want to go and quote something I don't normally. This was right at the beginning of a book by Alice Bailey called The Reappearance of the Christ. And there's a little quote from the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu book. And it says, "Wherever there is a withering of the law and the uprising of lawlessness on all sides, then I manifest myself for the salvation of the righteous and the destruction of such as do evil. For the firm establishing of the law I come to birth age after age." Obviously reincarnation, and I know from in the past, you get accosted by people that are Hare Krishnas or various offshoots of Hinduism, and that's a book that they quote. They always walk around with it, actually, the Bhagavad Gita. And you'd think by listening to that, apart from the reincarnation bit at the end, it would be like, oh, okay, that could almost be Christian. And then, basically Alice Bailey in her book says, the coming of the avatar, the advent of a coming one, and in terms of today, the reappearance of the Christ are the keynotes of the prevalent expectancy. When times are ripe, the invocation of the masses is strident enough, and the faith of those who know is keen enough, then he always has come, and today will be no exception to this ancient rule or this universal law. For decades, the reappearance of the Christ, the avatar, has been anticipated by the faithful in both hemispheres, not only in the Christian faithful, but by those who look for Maitreya and for the Bodhisattva. I can't even pronounce that word, it's a Hindu word, as well as those who expect the Imam Mahdi. So we have people looking for a Christ in all of these different religions, and there's a really interesting word there, avatar. What can you tell us about this, Marcia?
Yes, most people know avatar as a computer term for
yeah.
for a computer game or something, and this is my avatar, how they appear on the screen in a game or something. But avatar really does come from Hinduism, and technically it is the incarnation of the god Vishnu, who comes again and again in different forms when there is a crisis. When mankind is in a crisis, then Vishnu will come. He's even come as animals, like a turtle, and other creatures. And so there's this idea there, I believe there is one more final avatar. One more time Vishnu will come. Now, in the New Age, of course, they take things from Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism, and often they'll alter it a little, or it will just get altered through the Western culture. So in the New Age, usually when an avatar is referred to, the idea is that it's a spiritually enlightened being who is manifesting at will on earth, is appearing at will at some significant time to give a significant teaching to mankind. So it's kind of a spin on the Hindu idea of Vishnu. And the way this plays out in the New Age in a big way is that many people in the New Age believe Jesus was the avatar of the Age of Pisces. And so what this means is that he ushered in the Age of Pisces. Now, when I say the Age of Pisces, I just want to define that a little bit. There's something called the world ages. Each are 2,000 years long, approximately. It's as the Earth shifts on its axis, which it does. The North Pole gradually shifts the way it points to different constellations. And it goes backwards through the zodiac rather than forwards. Usually forward is Aries, Taurus, Gemini, etc. But backwards would be Gemini, Taurus, Aries, Pisces, Aquarius. That would be going backwards. And that's the way this shift happens. So according to that measurement, the North Pole is now in Aquarius, or it's either close to it or it's crossed over to it, depending on who you ask. But for 2,000 years, it was in Pisces, and that it started around the time of the birth of Christ. So he's very much identified with that, and there are other ways that New Agers see that identification. For example, Jesus had some fishermen as his disciples, and the symbol for Pisces is fish. Jesus also, had some teachings with fish where he had the disciples go out in their boat and he told them to haul the net down on the other side, and they brought in all that fish. There's several fish stories. After his resurrection, of course, he was cooking fish by the water for the disciples. So all of this fish imagery is taken by New Agers to symbolize the Age of Pisces. Another way it's done is that Jesus did talk about love in a kind of universal way, not like a personal thing, but more universal, loving everybody. And that's how they see Jesus's teachings. And in astrology, Pisces is a sign that encompasses more than individuality and encompasses something much bigger. So it can encompass a teaching or an idea that is universal. It's actually the opposite of Aries. Aries is the birth of the self, and Pisces is the dissolution of the self. So Pisces is a sign of self-sacrifice, self-sacrificial love. And so Jesus dying on the cross is seen as symbolizing the self-sacrificial love for humanity, which is very much a trait of Pisces in astrology. So when you're looking at those correlations as an astrologer or a New Ager, it seems to jump out at you that, well, who could possibly argue with this? Look at all of these things about Jesus that correlate with the meaning of Pisces, and he was the avatar of the Age of Pisces, clearly, because he was born at the beginning of it. And so that they make that correlation. And then the other thing that goes along with this is that the purpose of this whole thing of Jesus ushering in the Age of Pisces was that the Age of Pisces is supposedly a time of spiritual cleansing and preparation for the Age of Aquarius. So all of the religious movements that have taken place in the last 2,000 years, which of course would be Christianity and Islam and whatever other religions happened to come along during those 2,000 years, would all be seen as this way for the Age of Pisces to spiritually prepare mankind for the Age of Aquarius. Because Aquarius is, even though it's collectively oriented towards humanity as a brotherhood, it's also a sign of individuality and going against the grain, because it's ruled by the planet Uranus, which is considered somewhat of a rebellious type planet. So you have all this spiritual cleansing and all these spiritual teachers, from Jesus to the gurus of this, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially who went to the West, in particular the United States. And, you had all these people coming over, Krishnamurti, Ramakrishna, Yogananda, Rajneesh, etc., bringing Eastern teachings. And so all of this stuff is all seen as spiritual teachers bringing these teachings to prepare us for Aquarius, which is when the outer teacher disappears and becomes the inner teacher. Or rather, we go from the outer teacher to the inner teacher. And so, therefore, you start to listen within and you start to get guidance from your own sacred nature in the New Age view. So you go from listening to these teachers from outside yourself to within yourself. And that's part of the preparation as seen in the New Age. Now I wanted to say something about these correlations between Jesus and Pisces. And by the way, for those interested, I have an article on my website, christiananswersforthenewage.org, on this. If you look under the articles page, and look under in-depth articles, in the top right, you'll see the title, The Piscean Jesus, and that's all about this Jesus as the avatar of the Age of Pisces. But I give some biblical responses to this. For one thing, fish, of course, was a common thing in the areas where Jesus lived and taught, because that was their main source of protein. And so there were fishermen and there were fish. It was just part of the country's geography and culture. So it doesn't mean anything that Jesus had some fishermen as disciples and that there's some fish stories about Jesus. So that's just, you can't read a meaning into that, since that was just a common way of life there. And other correlations they make are the same thing. The fish one is a real big one. Jesus, of course, his death on the cross, yes, did indicate God's love for us. But, of course, it was much more than that. It wasn't just an act of love. This was to pay the penalty for sins. And Jesus did that, and he was the only one who could do that, paid the penalty for sins, so that all who believe in him can have eternal life. And of course, this is the part that New Agers don't accept, because they don't really believe in sin, or they would redefine it. So they would reject that idea. They would reject the idea that one needs salvation. That they wouldn't even agree with that. And certainly not from believing in someone like Jesus. So that whole part of the cross is rejected, and they just focus on the universal love. But then I also asked the question in my article about what is love, because New Agers talk about love a lot. It's a really big word in the New Age, along with light. And the thing is, there's no measurement or standard for love in the New Age, because they have no absolutes in the New Age. There's no absolutes at all. So how do you measure love, and what is this love? What does it mean? Because there's all kinds of love, or there's all kinds of things that we call love. And there's just really no way in the New Age to establish what love is, except subjectively. So you have this idea of love, and saying Jesus came to show love and teach love, but they really can't define it. And the way that we, as Christians, define it, of course, is God's love, which is shown throughout the Bible. And we love him because he first loved us. That's a quote in the New Testament. We only know love because of God's love. And God's love, of course, is perfect, because God is the standard for everything, the standard for love, for justice, for truth, for goodness, etc. And that love is a love that we can't even, live up to as humans. I think that the best passage to describe that is in 1 Corinthians 13, the famous love chapter. And a lot of even people who aren't Christians are familiar with that chapter, where it talks about faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. And then it gives the characteristics of love and what love is. Love holds no wrongs. love is forgiving, etc. It's the standard for love. And people may strive for it, but of course we can't reach it because we have the sin nature and we tend to be selfish. But the main point is that there is a standard for love, and it's based on God's character.
Completely different from, I'm thinking as you're saying this, thinking back to when I was growing up, and you had musicals like Hair, and you had this is the dawning of the Age of Aquarius, and then you had the Beatles and the Maharishi and all of that, and you had these love-ins and all of that sort of thing, all based on these kind of New Age, Eastern philosophies, being brought to the West, and that sort of standard of love was nothing to do with what we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 13.
Exactly. Yeah, and I may have said 1 Corinthians by mistake.
Oh, yeah, actually, well, yeah.
It's 2 Corinthians, right?
I better check.
I always, but those are really good examples, Tony. I think there was so much talk about.
No, you're right. It is 1 Corinthians, not 2 Corinthians.
First?
Yes, sorry, I'm the one that was wrong. Anyway, it's chapter 13.
Okay, I feel better now. I feel smart. But yeah, you're totally right about all those songs about love and brotherhood and peace and love. Being a very is a very common phrase, peace and love, and everybody talked about it, and in the New Age that's talked about. But I heard it a lot when I was in the New Age for a long time, and people just use that word all the time. And actually, I never actually sat down and tried to analyze, well, what do they mean when they say this? What is it based on? I just sort of accepted it, although I have to say that I felt it was overdone. I'm not a very sentimental or mushy person, and I sort of resented this kind of mushy love all the time that everybody would talk about, because then you could see the actions of people were not always according to love, but they talked about it. So sometimes it aggravated me a little bit when people went on and on and on like that. And I thought, yeah, well, it's easy to talk about it, but let's see you live it out, But, I still kind of accepted it. I never thought, well, what's it based on or what's the standard for it? It's just love. It's whatever you may think it is or what you feel it is. And that tends to be how New Agers see things. It's very much subjective, how they would express it or what they think love is and how they experience it. Just like it's the same for truth. Truth is how you perceive it, and your experiences are your truth. And so it's the same thing for love. And so there's no absolutes there. And so the contrast with that is very great with the Jesus of the Bible, and the love that is shown, the standard for love shown there is very high. And of course, this kind of love is a love that cannot accept evil, cannot accept anything that goes against God's nature. God cannot accept things that go against his nature. So he cannot accept sin. He can't accept evil. These are against his nature, and he has to judge them. There has to be judgment on them. And this, of course, is the whole reason that Jesus came, was because there has to be a judgment on sin, and that judgment was placed on Christ, who paid the penalty on the cross for those sins, so that if one believes in him, they can be forgiven of those sins. And that is the only way to go before God. So that is a great love, in that God gave us this way to be forgiven. But you have to acknowledge there's a need to be forgiven. And so, there's a lot of this New Age Jesus there will be bits and pieces about the New Age Jesus that will actually be true or seem true, because that's the way the New Age or any worldview is outside of Christianity, there will be bits and pieces of truth in it. It's usually truth mixed with error. And that's what makes it appealing, is because there are these things about it that are true, that appeal to people, and they think, well, yes, that's true. So, then they start to accept the other parts of it. And so there are things that are said about Jesus that are true. But
it's
you
sorry,
know,
just to
yeah,
again, then because the New Age Christ or Jesus is so different from what we as Christians believe in, and yet people could get confused by that. And I just another tiny little piece from that same Alice Bailey book that I read from before, where she says the avatars most easily known and recognized are the Buddha in the East and the Christ in the West. Their messages are familiar to all, and the fruits of their lives and words have conditioned the thinking and civilizations of both hemispheres because they are human divine avatars. So, I mean, there couldn't be a more contrasting message that Jesus spoke to Buddha. And
exactly.
this is what New Age does, isn't it?
Yeah.
They'll slap everything together, and I think that's what's sort of happening globally. Now we're watching religions being united and so on at the moment, and that's going to only grow more.
Yes, you're right. There is a lot of merging of ideas that actually are not that similar, but they're presented. Like Jesus and being compared to Buddha is very popular. And I noticed a lot of books starting to come out in the 90s where there were quotes from Jesus and Buddha side by side to try to show they were teaching the same thing. And I've heard and seen people say, well, Jesus was just teaching what Buddha taught. And things like that, or Jesus, some even say maybe Jesus even got some ideas from Buddha. And of course, that's pretty much impossible because the writings of Buddha were not written down from what I've looked at until 29 AD. And that was about 500 years after the death of Buddha, who's sort of a semi mythical character. He's not a very clear historical figure, but his teachings went around kind of, orally for 500 years. Probably it's very likely that what's considered to be the teachings of the Buddha may be some things patched together from different sources and then put under, the label, these are the teachings of Buddha. So we don't even know for sure that one person said all of these things. And Jesus, of course, the Buddha's teachings weren't, as far as I know, available or influencing anybody in Jesus's day in that area of the world. And when you look at what Jesus taught, even though there's ethically some similarities in a few things that you can find. And that's what most people try. They try to put together these ethical, moral teachings and say Jesus and Buddha are teaching the same thing. But then the contrast between them is much, much greater than the similarity. And I even have an article called, Buddha, or Buddhism and Christianity, where I show the contrast. And you have Buddhism, which denies this reality and as real, and denies the self as a permanent entity. So your self actually is not real. It only seems real, and it's real to you as you live it because you haven't understood yet that it doesn't actually exist. It's called the conventional self. And so the whole idea is that since everything in life is suffering, the only way to escape this is to liberate yourself from this false reality and all these false ideas and get into the state of mind where all of the false ideas are extinguished, which is called nirvana. And nirvana actually means to extinguish. So you extinguish all the false ideas through detaching yourself from them. And then you're in the state of nirvana. Well, where are you when you're in nirvana? There's no answer. They say, well, we don't know because, you have to You have to get to that state, and once you're in that state, you're not going to be around to, be able to tell anybody what it is. So there's not even really a description of it. It's just a state that you're in. It's not a place. It's not like Buddhist heaven. And you've escaped this reality. So I guess supposedly the idea is you're in some place of peace because you're no longer in a place of suffering, and there's no longer suffering. You kind of merge with the one truth, the one Buddha nature, which is all that exists. That's the only thing that actually has a permanent existence, is this Buddha nature or Buddha mind. And that's what you become a part of that. Now, of course, Jesus, the thing about not just Jesus, but the whole Bible, the Old Testament as well, is everybody's created in the image of God, is very individual. And you don't, when you die, you don't lose your individuality. If you've believed in Christ, you do go to a place where there's no suffering, but you're still you. You're still,
Yeah.
you're not just like some part of some Buddha mind or something. And of course, the teachings of Jesus had to do with sin and being forgiven of sin, and trusting in him, putting your faith in him, because we as humans on our own can't atone for our sins. We can't make up for them in any way. Jesus did that for us, and we have to believe in him. So it's the differences are incredible between Buddhism and Christianity, but they take surface things, and try to compare them. And this is true with other things too. There's even Wiccans who say they're Christian Wiccans, and they take ethical teachings of Jesus and they incorporate them into their belief system. And Jesus becomes sort of another divine figure, along with whatever goddess or gods they may or may not have in their group.
And I'm thinking too of there's that book, A Course in Miracles, which is another false Jesus, but they talk about the atonement in there. But if you actually read it, it's nothing to do with atonement as we would believe it as Christians. It's a completely different concept.
Yes, it is. It is. It is. And the Course in Miracles teaches there really is no such thing as sin.
Yeah.
So, once you take that away, the whole message of Jesus and Jesus himself has to be altered, because, then it's no longer the true Jesus if you take away the concept of sin or God's wrath on sin. So all these things kind of merge in the New Age. And I think in the New Age Jesus, who is often aligned with Buddha, Jesus is a wise spiritual master like Buddha. That's a very common way of thinking in the New Age. And I even thought that. But it's because you're ignoring what the Bible plainly teaches, because it's preferable and easier to believe in this other thing, this sort of mass love that kind of excuses everything, and you can become spiritually enlightened and advance on your own. It appeals very much to individual pride. I can become enlightened. I am working on myself. I have a spiritual path. I'm choosing my spiritual teachings. And so you can have this New Age Jesus, and he'll fit into your idea of what it means to be spiritual. And you'll draw on the New Age Jesus. And there's many New Age books that, use Jesus. They're either about Jesus or they use him in the teachings, and they all are very compatible with the New Age view. I should say that, there's two main ideas of the New Age Jesus. One is that Jesus came not only to show love, but that he was a human who modeled the idea and understood the idea that we all have a divine nature. And by realizing his divine nature, he achieved Christ consciousness. And this was actually a teaching of New Thought, which was a movement distinct from the New Age, but the New Age drew a lot of ideas from New Thought. And so Christ consciousness is an idea in the New Age, that you can achieve this Christ consciousness. Now, not all New Agers follow this. There are New Agers who are very deep into Buddhism or Hinduism, and they may see Jesus as a spiritual figure, but he's not the focus of their spirituality. So they don't really care about Christ consciousness. But there are some New Agers who do adopt that idea. And then there's the idea of the Christ spirit, that there's this sort of Christ spirit, which is kind of like this spiritual understanding that can descend on people who are ready for it. And you can have the Christ spirit, or different teachers can have the Christ spirit, and then they teach with this kind of Christ wisdom. And one of the teachers of this idea is Edgar Cayce, who is very famous in the United States. I don't know how famous he is outside the United States, but have you heard of Edgar Cayce, Tony?
I do, but I don't really know much about him.
Okay, he is, in fact, I live in Virginia, and his headquarters is down in Virginia Beach, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which my former husband and I, and with our son, visited. We actually visited. Of course, this is when I was in the New Age,
Yeah.
and we took a tour of it. Edgar Cayce had a big influence in this country because he was originally a Sunday school teacher, and then he, through the loss of his voice, and then getting the advice of this man, where he was kind of hypnotized, and he diagnosed himself successfully, and this man continued to teach him and got him to agree to start going into these trances where he would get this information that he would give. He was basically what I would consider to be a channel. He was channeling information, although I don't think that word is used of him. But he did go into these. He's called the sleeping prophet. And he would go into these trances, and many Christians, saw him as a Christian. I was surprised when I first started speaking for my ministry that I had several people ask me what I thought of Edgar Cayce and if I thought he was a Christian. And I was still kind of naive early in my ministry, and I was sort of shocked by the question. I'm like, What? How can you think he was a Christian?
Yeah.
But I mean, of course, I didn't say that, but I was a little surprised. And so this idea, because he would talk about Jesus, and of course he believed in reincarnation and that Jesus lived many lives. So, I mean, pretty quickly you can see that what he was teaching was not Christianity. But because of this background of being a Sunday school teacher and talking about Jesus, a lot of people have these very confused, and I mean, I have run into many of them, these confused ideas of whether he was a Christian or not. And he taught this Christ spirit thing. By the way, I do have an article on Edgar Cayce on my website too, if anybody wants to read that. So, you have these different kind of New Age Jesuses, and the avatar of the Age of Pisces is very popular. And of course, the idea of the Age of Aquarius is very big in the New Age. I mean, even I don't just mean, people who are astrologers, but I mean just New Agers in general. Have this idea, like you mentioned, the musical Hair and that song, this is the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. It became kind of part of pop culture for a while, and a lot of people who maybe don't even remember the song probably know about it or have heard of it. They may not know what it means, but it's sort of part of pop culture mentality. And so what is the Age of Aquarius, aside from us going from the outer teacher to the inner teacher? It's that we start transcending boundaries. So distinctions begin to fall away. Androgyny is considered a hallmark of the Age of Aquarius. So not identifying with a particular gender.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Just androgyny, or being both genders, maybe.
Yeah.
And then you have the idea of people will want to serve for the greater good. It won't be, each person out for himself or herself. It will be we're all going to collectively work for the greater good. That's another idea. And another idea is peace, that the Age of Aquarius is going to be about having world peace. So this is part of the Age of Aquarius as well. Now, of course, I want to say there are a lot of people who like the idea of world peace and think we can achieve it, who know nothing about the Age of Aquarius or who maybe would find it completely silly. So I don't want to say everybody who thinks world peace is a good idea, it's because of the Age of Aquarius. But people who are into that definitely see it that way. So that's another hallmark of the Age of Aquarius. And another one is that there's two things. There will be technological advances, very rapid technological advances. And there also will be, people will be able to cultivate their psychic powers better, or people will actually be born with these very high functioning psychic powers. That's part of this whole indigo children thing that a lot of people have asked me about. So there's, people being born with these powers. That's kind of the idea. Now, some of these things I've mentioned, a lot of people are thinking, well, wow, I can see that happening, kind of this gender neutral thing, androgyny, and, the ideas of world peace and rapid technological development, Well, the thing is that a lot of this stuff, I mean, you can read into something whatever you want. You can take the aspects of Aquarius and apply it to the culture and say, well, yeah, look at this. The other thing, I think there's many ways to look at this. Another way to look at this is, of course, you can never rule out coincidence. But another way to look at this is that, Jesus said that this world is under the sway of the evil one. He is the God of the age. He's the God of this age, which is an age where we're living under the sway of Satan until Jesus comes back. And so, therefore, things can be manipulated, in my opinion, to appear. False things can appear to be true. Let me put it that way. So who knows? I don't know how that would work, but I think that things are going to appear, false things are going to appear to be very true more and more. So that I think people are going to be more open to false ideas, and they'll think they see evidence of it, or they'll see evidence for it. Because there's a lot of things about Aquarius too that are very contradictory. For example, if the idea is that we want world peace and we're going to work for the greater good, what about the idea that Aquarius is also very individualistic and rebellious? That's a big part of Aquarius. It's there's this rebellion factor in Aquarius, this breaking through against anything that's structured or anything that's being imposed by authority. It's a very anti-authority kind of sign. And yet, if you're going to have all these things happening, world peace, and you're going to have people doing things for the collective good, you've got to have some kind of structure. Otherwise, everything's just going to be, chaos. None of that would work in chaos. So there's a lot of inner contradictions in Aquarius and what Aquarius means. And even as an astrologer, I can tell you that I found them somewhat confounding, because they would be like opposite things. Well, how do these things work out? They're like opposite. And so, how can you care about the greater good and be individualistic? And, there's just a lot of contradictions in there. I point some of this out in my article on the Age of Aquarius. And I also talk about some of the things happening. One of the things I point out when I said something about androgyny and, getting away from the traditional gender roles, actually, this is actually ancient, because it goes back to ancient paganism. And you can go back to the pagan gods, and there were gods who had both sexes, so to speak. There were gods who were androgynous. There were, gods who were men who looked like women, et cetera, et cetera. you can go back, this whole gender thing goes back to a lot of the pagan gods. I remember seeing a movie years ago by, I cannot think of his name. He was a very avant-garde Italian filmmaker, very famous. He did a lot of films, and his name's just escaped me now. But he did a film I remember seeing, and there's a figure in the film who represents some kind of Hindu god, and it's a person. This person who represents this god is both a man and a woman, and it was kind of a startling image. I remember it very well.
Well, of course, you see a lot of the image of the Baphomet, Eliphas Levi's, that's very androgynous, but with a goat head, but the half male, half female thing. So, yeah.
Exactly. That's a good example. And you see it with even the Ankh, the Egyptian Ankh that kind of looks like a cross, but it's got a big circle on top. It's supposed to be the blending of the male symbol and the female symbol. And yin and yang is the same thing. You've got yang as the male energy, yin female energy, and then they attach different qualities to male and female, and that's combined, that makes a whole. So this goes back a long time ago. This is not a new idea. It's just that it's playing out in our culture now because of many different things. So it doesn't mean, oh, well, definitely then we're in the age of Aquarius because of this. This is just something that's playing out that's actually just pagan. And I think a lot of pagan things are playing out right now. So that's an example that I discuss in my article. And so we need to be critical thinkers and think things through and think, okay, but let's think about this. Jesus is like Buddha. Well, no. What does Buddhism believe? What does Jesus teach? What about this age of Aquarius? Well, there are other times when there were things that happened, like the Industrial Revolution was extremely revolutionary, completely changed the lifestyle of people around the world. And, it was quite a leap to go from horse and buggy to trains and cars. Well, I guess cars came a little later, but it was sort of a result of that, all that mechanical explosion. And, that was a huge leap. Well, that wasn't in the age of Aquarius. That was in the age of Pisces, which doesn't have anything to do at all, even remotely, with anything mechanical or inventive or scientific. So, it's, there were scientific things happening years ago in the age of Pisces. So,
but
I think
they are the new ages are basically looking for the next avatar, though, aren't they? Like the reappearance of the Christ, as Alice Bailey would say. And as Christians, we're sort of expecting, well, the return of Jesus, but also an antichrist or false Christ. And I mean, I'm seeing an awful lot of sort of false Christ stuff happening at the moment. And I mean, there are people talking about this guy, the Raelian movement, they think that he's the Christ, and so on.
Yes.
So how does that fit in with, the age of Aquarius? They're actually looking for a Christ.
Right. Well, let me say a lot of New Agers are not looking for a Christ because, as I mentioned before, a lot of New Agers are not into the Christ idea.
Right.
I, for example, wasn't. I found Christ intriguing, but I didn't really believe that another Christ was coming. I just found that completely unbelievable. Well, let me put it this way. Actually, I take that back. I had my own idea of it, and I actually wrote 3 series of articles for a New Age magazine I was writing called Children of the Age of Pisces. Oh, I meant to mention this earlier. And what I described in those articles was what the purpose of the Age of Pisces was and how it affected our culture. And so that was 3 articles, rather long articles I did. And what I wrote about Jesus in there, because I had to put him in because he's the avatar of the Age of Pisces, was that when he came, it would be a coming within. It wouldn't be external. It wouldn't be a figure out there because it would be an internal kind of understanding, or maybe you could even say achieving a Christ consciousness, although that's not the way I put it, because I didn't use those terms or that concept. But I mean, some did. But so I said, when Jesus comes again, it won't be in the sky. It will be within us. I actually wrote that in my article. So I had a concept of this internal Christ appearing through everybody who was spiritually advanced enough for that. And so, because since the Age of Aquarius is about the internal teacher and not the external teacher, I think a lot of New Agers are not thinking there's going to be a figure called Jesus, or who will represent Christ or be Jesus coming. An external figure is no longer what a lot of New Agers are looking for. They think we've gone past that. That was part of the Age of Pisces. So they aren't. I'm not saying that there aren't some looking for that, but I can tell you from all the friends I knew, none of them were looking for an external teacher. I mean, none of them ever talked about Jesus coming again. None of them had the Alice Bailey idea. That's a certain segment of the New Age, and I just, I knew a lot of people who read Alice Bailey and liked her. And I didn't read Alice Bailey, but I read Annie Besant, who came along after Alice Bailey and was the head of Theosophy for a while. I was very influenced by her book and her ideas, extremely deeply influenced by them. I can't remember if she talked about Christ coming again or not. I don't think she did. But so some New Agers have that idea, some don't. But of course, I think that a lot of people will easily fall into wanting to believe somebody who seems to promise this world peace, or, seems to promise something for people, which, of course, the world peace idea is in the Age of Aquarius. And if someone comes along, even if they're not looking for some external Christ figure, someone comes along who seems to fulfill the role of someone who can usher in all this peace and everything, or unity, obviously a lot of people are going to fall for that, because we know from Revelation that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so then that could be, a lot of people may see the Antichrist. It would make a lot of sense if they saw the Antichrist as that Christ figure. Of course, it would be the false Christ, but they would think this is the Christ coming back. And I think even in Islam, I'm not, super familiar with Islam, but I think there's a teaching of somebody coming in the future. I think even riding a white horse.
Yeah, the Mahdi.
I heard someone talking about that.
The Mahdi, they call him. Yep.
Okay, the Mahdi, right. And then in Hinduism, as I said earlier, they're thinking there's going to be one more incarnation of Vishnu. And so, this false Christ could fulfill that Hindu idea, could fulfill that maybe Islamic idea, it could fulfill the idea of some New Agers.
And of course, the Orthodox Jews and so on that rejected Jesus as the Messiah are still looking for their Messiah as well.
Right, exactly. So a lot of different people in different religious groups or different spiritual belief systems are looking for that person come. Yeah, exactly. So that's very interesting when you kind of think about that, yes. About what that could mean, because they are looking for that. And like I say, even people who may not believe, depending on when it's all going to happen, may not believe right now, maybe things in the New Age, there's a core that stays the same, core beliefs and ways of seeing things, but then other things change in the New Age a lot. New Age is always adapting and always changing and shifting. This idea that Alice Bailey had about the Christ coming could come up again. It could come up with another teacher who was inspired by Bailey, let's say, and starts teaching it again. And maybe even puts a spin on it. Who knows? Because in the New Age, you just never know what's going to happen. All kinds of things can come out of the New Age. I'm constantly amazed at the things I'm seeing, now coming out of the New Age, and it's so well disguised and sometimes so subtle, much more subtle than when I was in it. To me, I think it was more obvious when I was in it, because the culture was still, well, the New Age wasn't mainstreamed then. I think it started mainstreaming while I was still in it, but then it really took off after I became a Christian, and I've been tracking it ever since. And so you just don't know. There's all these permutations that can take place.
In a practical application now, for Christians that are listening, what do you suggest for them? Like, what relevance do you see as the main thing why we needed to get this message across today?
Okay, I think a main thing would be we need to be aware that first of all, a lot of false teachings will use Jesus or use Christianity or claim to be Christian. So, I mean, you even have some New Agers who call themselves Christians, or sometimes they'll say they're mystical Christians. And so we have to be aware of that there's going to be people who sound Christian or who talk about Jesus, but it's not going to be the biblical Jesus. It's not going to be the historical biblical Jesus. It's not going to be the Christian faith. It's just going to sound like it. So I think we need to be aware of that, because I think that, as I said earlier, the deceptions are getting more subtle. And it's also good to know where New Agers are in their thinking on what's happening now, because if you have relatives, neighbors, coworkers into some of these New Age ideas, and that's how they're seeing reality, it's good to be aware of that so that you can talk to them about it and ask them, why do you think it's the Age of Aquarius? Why is the Age of Aquarius good? What about love? How do you define love? I mean, there's lots of directions you can go with that. So I think Christians need to be aware, like that verse in the Bible where I think Paul wrote, we're not unaware of Satan's schemes. We don't have to investigate and try to know. We can't know all the things that are Satan is doing, but we can be on our toes for deception and be aware of ideas that, especially if they seem Christian, we just can't accept things at face value. We have to investigate.
And how would you suggest they investigate? I mean, I'm thinking straight off, people need to be reading their Bibles for themselves regularly so they can actually allow God to speak to them and show them what's false.
Oh, I agree with you there. Yes. Knowing the word, God's word, is number one. I mean, that is so crucial. And I'm afraid a lot now it's very popular to read books about the Bible or read books by Christians who are writing about certain ideas and not read the Bible itself. We really need to read the Bible itself. So yeah, absolutely. Because otherwise you're just, it's much, much harder to evaluate these things. So, that's one thing. And the other is just to be, I don't know, they can go to my website and find out about the New Age. I have lots of articles on there. And I'm also on Facebook, by the way. So,
yep, give them your website again.
Okay.
Yep.
Sure. Christian Answers for the New Age.org. And go to the articles page. That's probably where you would want to go. And there's a lot of articles on there. And I'm in full-time ministry. I've been in it since 1998. And I also want to say that, if you look at, for example, the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy, Paul is constantly admonishing Timothy, hold to sound doctrine. Hold to sound doctrine. I think in 1st Timothy, he repeats that a number of times. Hold to sound doctrine. In other words, test everything by the scripture and hold to that. Don't be swayed. There's a lot of winds in the church today, a lot of winds that can knock you around and, take you away from sound doctrine.
Yeah.
And even if it's popular, even if your pastor is into it or people that you admire, if it is not lining up with scripture and is going against something crucial in scripture, you need to stand on the sound doctrine and not go the way that's popular. So I would also say that.
And that's a very good point. Yeah, well, it's been another fascinating discussion, and the time flies.
It really
I,
did. Oh my goodness, I couldn't believe it.
yeah, I know it always does, but yeah. So thank you so much for being on this Minute to Midnight show again today, Marcia. And yeah, we'll probably have to come back again before too long and carry on, do some more on this.
Okay, I enjoyed our discussion very much, Tony. It's always interesting to discuss these things with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Folks, don't forget to like and share this video if you're watching it on YouTube. And of course, you can also find it as audio only on iTunes and as video and audio on our website, aminutetomidnight.com. And all our shows and articles are there. And also we run A Minute to Midnight by donations 100%. Greatly appreciate the people that do donate to help us keep running. It's only by your help through donations that we do keep this going. So thank you folks for who do donate. And all the music that is used on the shows is written, played and recorded by me. And if you want to download the music for free, you can do that on aminutetomidnight.com as well. And we do have a forum, by the way. You're welcome to join the forum on our website, aminutetomidnight.com, and please do contribute to some of the conversations there. That's about it for today. We will catch you with another show in a few days' time. Have a great week and God bless.